The year was 1876, a time when the mountains still held their own counsel and the silence was a physical presence. For Elias Vance, that silence was both a refuge and a penance. He was a trapper, a man who had sought the harshest, most isolated corners of the Rockies to outrun a grief that had the weight and substance of a second shadow. The cold air of his small, meticulously kept cabin was thick with the ghosts of a wife's laughter and a son's first words, memories he polished with a loneliness so profound it had become the very architecture of his soul. His days were a litany of simple, hard tasks. He checked his trap lines, the snap of steel, a stark punctuation in the vast quiet. He skinned his catch with an efficiency that was mechanical, his hands moving with a memory of their own, allowing his mind to remain a still, frozen lake. He tanned the hides, the acrid scent of the chemicals, a familiar sting that grounded him in the present, pulling him back from the undertow of the past. He had come here, to this high, unforgiving country, after the fever had taken his Abigail and their boy, Caleb, within a week of each other. The world of towns and people, with its easy comforts and casual cruelties, had become unbearable. Here, the sorrow was at least honest. The wind that tore at the pines sounded like a thing grieving, and in its howl, Elias felt a sliver of kinship. His life was a spare, brutalist poem written in solitude. He spoke to no one, saw no one for months at a time. The only sound he ever made, other than the necessary noises of survival, was a hum. It was a simple, unadorned folk melody, a tune Abigail had sung to lull their son to sleep. It was a river song, about water finding its way over stone and through darkness, forever seeking the sea. For Elias, to hum it was to hold a shard of his former life, sharp enough to hurt, but too precious to let go. He never sang the words. The words belonged to her, and his voice felt like a trespasser in their sacred space. One afternoon, while checking a line in a box canyon miles from his cabin, he felt a change in the air. It was a stillness that was different from the usual quieter held breath. He moved with the practiced stealth of a man who lives among predators, his rifle held loosely at his side. Peering through a thicket of aspen, he saw them. A large encampment of Cheyenne, their lodges arranged in a solemn circle. This was not a war party or a hunting group. The mood was too heavy, too funereal. Smoke curled from a central fire, but there was none of the usual camp noise, no laughter, no children playing, no dogs barking. There was only a low, collective murmur of sorrow. His instinct, honed by years of isolation, screamed at him to retreat. He was a white man, an intruder in a moment of private, tribal pain. To be discovered here could be a death sentence. Yet he remained, frozen in place. In the center of the camp, before the largest lodge, he could see a figure lying on a pallet of buffalo robes. An old man, his chest bare and his face etched with the deep lines of a long and formidable life. Warriors, their faces painted in subdued colors of mourning, stood vigil. Women knelt nearby, their heads bowed. This was a chief, and he was dying. Elias felt an unwelcome and powerful pull of recognition. The scene resonated with a frequency he knew in his bones, the quiet, desperate vigil at the edge of life's end. He saw their powerlessness in the face of the inevitable, and it was a mirror to the helplessness that had shattered his own world. He should have left. Every rational part of his mind knew it. But his feet were rooted to the spot, held fast by a current of shared humanity that was stronger than his fear. As he watched, a tall warrior, his expression a mask of strained composure, turned, and his eyes met Elias's across the clearing. The moment stretched, thin and taut as a bowstring. There was no time to run. The warrior, Honyahaka, son of the chief, strode towards him. He moved with a liquid grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. Elias did not raise his rifle. He stood his ground, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had nothing to offer, nothing to defend but his own lonely existence. Honyahaka stopped 10 feet away, his dark eyes sweeping over Elias, taking in the worn buckskins, the gaunt face, the profound weariness in his posture. He saw not a threat, but a man as weathered and solitary as a lone pine on a high ridge. Silence hung between them, thick with suspicion and unspoken questions. Elias, in a gesture he didn't fully understand himself, slowly unslung the canteen from his shoulder and held it out. It was a simple offering, water, the currency of life in this hard land. Honyahaka's eyes flickered to the canteen, then back to Elias's face. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, not of acceptance, but of acknowledgement. He did not take the water. Instead, he gestured with his chin back toward the camp. It was not a command, but it was not an invitation either. It was a complex statement. You are seen, you are an outsider, but for now, you may remain. Elias lowered his canteen, his arm trembling slightly. He understood. He was being allowed to bear witness. He retreated to the edge of the clearing, finding a place among the shadows of the pines, and settled in for a long vigil. The sun bled across the sky, bruising it into the deep purples and oranges of dusk. The air grew colder. The low chanting from the camp began, a rhythmic, mournful sound that seemed to pull the darkness closer. Elias watched as the medicine man performed his rites, his movements ancient and filled with a desperate hope. He saw Honyahaka kneel by his father's side, his stoicism finally cracking as he placed a hand on the old man's chest. The night deepened, becoming a vast, star-dusted cathedral of sorrow. The chief's breaths grew ragged, each one a struggle, a fight the old warrior was slowly losing. Elias felt the familiar chill of impending loss creep into his own heart, a phantom limb aching with a remembered pain. He saw his own face in Honyahaka's. He saw Abigail's weakening form in the chief's. The grief he had so carefully walled off for years breached its dam, flooding him with an empathy so overwhelming it left him breathless. And without conscious thought, the hum began in his chest. It rose to his throat, and for the first time since the fever, the words followed, whispered into the cold night air. "Oh, the river, it runs to the sea," he sang, his voice raspy from disuse, yet clear in the profound stillness. "Through the valley, for you and for me." It was Abigail's song, a lullaby for a dying child, a hymn of gentle passage for a fading spirit. The chanting around the fire faltered, then stopped. Every head in the Cheyenne camp turned towards the tree line, towards the source of the strange, soft melody. Honyahaka looked up, his face a mixture of shock and bewilderment. Elias didn't stop. He couldn't. The song was a current, and he was caught in it. It flows through the dark and the stone. You are never, no, never alone. He sang of a journey, not an end. He sang of peace, not of struggle. He laid the most sacred, painful piece of his heart bare for these strangers to see. He sang for the dying chief, Vokin. He sang for Caleb. He sang for Abigail. He sang until the song was done, the last note hanging in the air like a ghost before being absorbed by the immense silence of the mountains. In the quiet that followed, a change occurred. The chief's ragged breathing eased, a look of profound peace settled over his ancient features. He took one more long, gentle breath, and then was still. Vokin, the great chief of the Cheyenne, had completed his journey. Honyahaka looked from his father's serene face to the shadows where the white man hid, a look of awe and reverence dawning in his eyes. Elias, feeling as though he had given up a part of his own spirit, quietly melted back into the forest and made the long, weary trek to his cabin, leaving the Cheyenne to their grief and the dawn to its slow arrival. He fell into his cot fully clothed, an exhaustion deeper than any he had ever known pulling him into a dark, dreamless sleep. He slept through the dawn and into the full light of morning, waking only when he sensed a profound shift in his world. The usual morning sounds, the chatter of a squirrel, the distant call of a hawk were gone. An absolute, pressing silence surrounded his cabin. It was the silence of 100 held breaths. Elias rose slowly, his body aching. He moved to the single small window, his heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat of dread. He pulled back the corner of the worn burlap curtain and looked out. And his world stopped. They were there. The entire Cheyenne nation, it seemed. Warriors stood in silent, ordered ranks, their lances and bows held at rest. Behind them were the women, the children, the elders. They formed a vast, silent sea of humanity that stretched from the edge of his clearing back into the trees. They were not painted for war. Their faces were solemn, patient, watchful. They were not besieging his cabin, they were holding vigil. 800 people, their collective gaze fixed on his small, lonely dwelling. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through him. This was it. They had come for him. Perhaps the song was an offense, a blasphemy. Perhaps his presence at their chief's death was a trespass that could only be paid for with his life. He was trapped, one man against a nation. His rifle was by the door, but it was a useless stick against such a number. He was a dead man. His isolation, the fortress he had built for himself, had been shattered, and now the world was flooding in to claim him. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence outside a crushing weight. He could not run, could not hide. He could only wait. Finally, a single figure detached himself from the front rank and began to walk towards the cabin. It was Honyahaka. He moved not with menace, but with a deliberate, formal grace. He carried no weapon in his hands. He stopped before the door and waited. Elias's mind raced. He could stay inside, a coward in his wooden tomb, or he could face his end with what little dignity he had left. He thought of Abigail, of the courage with which she had faced her end. He thought of his son. He would not die cowering in the dark. Taking a deep, ragged breath, he unlatched the door and stepped out into the blinding light, blinking against the sun and the overwhelming sight of the waiting tribe. Honyahaka stood before him, his face a study in deep, solemn emotion. He looked at Elias, his gaze direct and filled with an intensity that went beyond mere language. Then he spoke, his voice low and clear, using the few halting English words he knew, supplemented by the elegant, expressive signs of his people. The song, he said, his hand gesturing first to the sky, to the spirit world, and then to his own heart. For my father. He pointed back towards the camp, a place Elias could no longer see. He traveled, on the song. His hands made a motion like a smoothly flowing river. Peace. His spirit has peace. Elias stared, his mind struggling to comprehend. This wasn't an execution, this wasn't vengeance, it was something else entirely. Honyahaka took a step closer, his eyes pleading. The farewell song, the spirit song, it is good medicine. He gestured to the silent, waiting nation behind him. My people, we must know the words, we must learn the song. For Vokin, and for all who will travel after him. He looked directly into Elias's eyes, the unspoken question hanging between them, heavier than any threat. You will teach us. The request was staggering. It was an invasion far more profound than any physical attack. They wanted him to take the most private artifact of his heart, the last pure memory of his wife and child, and share it. To give it away. The song was his alone. It was the hymn of his personal church of sorrow. To teach it would be to unlock the door to that sanctuary and let the entire world in. It would mean singing it again and again, feeling the sharp edge of its grief with every note, every word, until it was no longer his. He looked past Honyahaka, at the hundreds of faces watching him. He saw stoic warriors, their eyes holding a raw, fresh grief. He saw mothers clutching their children, their expressions a mixture of sorrow and hope. He saw old men whose faces were maps of a life lived, now contemplating their own final journey. He did not see a threat. He saw a people drowning in the same ocean of loss that he had been adrift in for years. They were not asking to take his pain, but to share it, to transform a personal lullaby into a communal anthem of remembrance. In that moment, Elias Vance understood. His grief was not a fortress to be defended, it was a bridge. His song was not a relic to be hidden away, it was a gift to be given. To refuse would be to deny them the peace it had brought their chief, and to deny himself the first real human connection he had been offered in years. It was a choice between the cold, dead safety of his past and the terrifying, vibrant possibility of a shared present. He took a long, shuddering breath, the clean mountain air filling his lungs. He looked at Honyahaka and gave a slow, deliberate nod. A quiet sigh, a collective exhalation of relief, passed through the assembled tribe. Elias cleared his throat, which felt tight with unshed tears. He stood straight before the 800 waiting souls, and he began. "Oh, the river," he sang, his voice trembling at first, but gaining strength with each word. "It runs to the sea." He sang the first line, and then he paused, motioning with his hand. After a moment of hesitation, a few voices tried to mimic the sounds, then a few more. Honyahaka's rich baritone joined in, strong and clear. Soon, a chorus of voices, awkward and uncertain, rose to repeat the phrase. He sang the next line, "Through the valley, for you and for me." Again he waited, and again they sang it back to him. 800 voices, learning a melody of loss and release. The sound was strange, haunting, and impossibly beautiful. It echoed from the canyon walls, a testament to a moment that should never have happened, a connection forged between two worlds by a simple, sad song. For 3 days, Elias taught them. He broke the song down line by line, word by word. He walked among them, correcting pronunciation, humming the melody for small groups of children, his initial terror replaced by a sense of profound, surreal purpose. He shared his meager rations with them, and in return they brought him roasted venison and flatbread. He learned Honyahaka's name, and the Cheyenne learned his. They did not speak much, for they had no real common language. They had something more fundamental. They had the song. On the morning of the 4th day they were ready. Honyahaka gave a signal, and the entire tribe faced the east, towards the rising sun. Then, as one, they began to sing. The harmony was imperfect, the English words shaped by a foreign tongue, but the emotion was pure. 800 voices sang Abigail's lullaby to the mountains, a final, powerful farewell to their fallen chief. Elias stood apart, listening, and felt the tight, cold knot of his own grief begin to dissolve, not vanishing, but loosening, its bitter concentration diluted in that great chorus of shared humanity. He was no longer singing alone. When the song was finished, a peaceful silence settled over the valley. The Cheyenne began to quietly and efficiently break down their camp. Honyahaka approached Elias one last time. He placed a hand over his own heart, then extended it to Elias, a gesture of deep respect and gratitude. In his other hand, he held a magnificent buffalo robe, its hide painted with the story of Vokin's life. He laid it gently over Elias's shoulders. "Elias Vance," Honyahaka said, the name sounding strange and important in his mouth. "Your song is now our song. You are not forgotten." And with that, they left. The great sea of people flowed back into the forest, as quietly as they had arrived, their soft footfalls leaving little trace on the land. But their presence had left an indelible mark on him. Elias returned to his cabin. The silence that greeted him was different now. It was not the oppressive, empty silence of loneliness. It was a restful, contemplative quiet, filled with the echo of 800 voices. The cabin no longer felt like a tomb for his memories, but a place where a profound act of living had occurred. Months later, as the first snows of winter began to dust the peaks, Elias stood outside his door, the painted buffalo robe wrapped around him. The wind soughed through the pines, and for a moment he thought he could hear a faint, distant melody carried on the breeze. He smiled, a small, unfamiliar feeling on his face. He began to hum the river song, and then, his voice soft but steady, he sang the words. They were still his, and they were still Abigail's. But now they belonged to the mountains, too. His grief was no longer a weight that held him down. It was a song, and he had learned, at last, how to let it fly. He was still a man of the wilderness, but he was no longer a man alone. The year was 1885, and the autumn was dying a slow, brutal death on the Dakota plains. For Clara Prescott, it felt like a mirror to her own life. The small, half-finished cabin Walter had started building for them stood as a monument to broken promises, its raw pine bones bleaching under a sky the color of a day-old bruise. The wind, a constant, mournful presence, scraped across the vast, empty land, whispering of the winter that was already gathering its strength in the north. She had arrived in the town of Prospect's Hope a month prior, her steamer trunk filled with linens, her heart filled with the quiet, steady flame of a promised future. Walter Hale, the man she had known since childhood, the man whose letters had painted this harsh land as a canvas for their shared dream, was supposed to meet her at the church. He had. But instead of a ring and a vow, he had left her a note, a single sterile sheet of paper tucked into the hymnal on the front pew. It said he had gone to California, that he was sorry, and that he hoped she would understand. She did not understand. She understood only the hollow echo in the small church, the burn of pity in the eyes of the minister, and the snickering whispers that followed her as she walked, head held high. From the town back to the lonely cabin that was now her cage, she had just enough money to survive the winter, but not enough to endure the humiliation of a return journey to Ohio, and so she stayed. Her days fell into a rhythm of grim necessity. The swing of the axe as she chopped wood was a punctuation mark in the endless silence. The ache in her back from tending the meager garden was a constant, grounding pain. Loneliness was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest in the long, dark evenings. Her only companion was the ghost of a life that would never be, and its most tangible artifact was the wedding dress. It lay carefully folded in her trunk, a whisper of ivory silk and delicate lace. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, she would take it out, its cold, smooth fabric, a painful reminder of the woman she was supposed to have become, a wife, a mother, the center of a home. Now, it was just a costly shroud for a dead dream. Her existence was one of profound stasis, a life lived in the gray space between a past that had been stolen and a future she could not imagine. The vast, unforgiving land did not care for her sorrow. It demanded resilience, or it would simply swallow her whole. So she carried on, her heart frozen under a layer of stoic resolve, a woman isolated not just by geography, but by a grief so sharp and public it had become her defining feature. The first blizzard of the season arrived without warning, a sudden, violent assault of white fury that descended upon the plains. The world beyond her small window dissolved into a churning chaos of wind and snow. The wind howled like a thing grieving, clawing at the cabin, seeking out every crack in the chinking. Clara stuffed rags into the gaps, her breath pluming in the frigid air inside her own home. For 2 days, she was a prisoner, the roar of the storm her only companion. The silence that had once oppressed her was replaced by a terror that was somehow more alive, more immediate. On the third morning, the wind lessened to a low, guttural moan. The snow was still falling, but in thick, heavy flakes, no longer driven by the gale. Peering through a small section of the frost-etched window, Clara saw a world remade, buried under a deep, pristine blanket of white. It was in that moment of stillness, as the world held its breath, that she saw it. A shape, dark against the snow, stumbling, falling, and rising again. At first, she thought it was an animal, a deer lost from its herd. But as it drew closer, staggering toward the faint wisp of smoke from her chimney, she saw it was a person, a woman. Her movements were desperate, a slow-motion struggle against the crushing weight of the snow and an unseen exhaustion. Clara's heart seized. Her first instinct, born of the town's fearful talk and her own isolation, was to bar the door. The warnings about the Lakota, driven from their lands and pushed to desperation, echoed in her mind. But the figure fell again, a final, collapsing heap in the snowdrift that had built up against the woodpile and did not move. It was a gesture of such complete surrender that it broke through Clara's fear. She could not leave a dog to die like that, let alone a human being. Wrapping her thickest wool shawl around her shoulders, she pulled on her boots and fought her way out the door, the cold, a physical blow to her face. The snow was thigh-deep, a thick, powdery trap. She reached the fallen woman and knelt, turning her over. It was a young Lakota woman, her face ashen with cold, her lips blue, her dark eyes fluttered open, unfocused, clouded with pain and fear. She was wearing only thin, worn buckskin, utterly inadequate for the storm's fury. And beneath the deerskin tunic, Clara saw the unmistakable, gentle swell of a life nearing its term. The woman was heavily pregnant. All the warnings, all the prejudice, all the fear evaporated in a single, gut-wrenching wave of empathy. This was not a threat. This was a mother fighting for 2 lives against a merciless world. Summoning a strength she did not know she possessed, Clara hooked her arms under the woman's shoulders and began to drag her, inch by painful inch, through the deep snow and toward the sanctuary of the cabin. The door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the mournful cry of the wind and leaving only the sound of 2 women's ragged breathing in the sudden, shocking silence. Inside the relative warmth of the cabin, the Lakota woman lay on a pallet of blankets near the fire, shivering uncontrollably. Clara worked quickly, her own fear replaced by a focused, urgent purpose. She peeled away the frozen layers of buckskin, her hands recoiling from the icy cold of the woman's skin. She wrapped her in every spare blanket she owned, chafing her hands and feet to restore circulation. She forced warm broth, spoonful by spoonful, between her chapped lips. There was no language between them, only the universal dialect of need and care. The woman's eyes, dark and intelligent, followed Clara's every move. There was fear in them, yes, but also a dawning awareness, a flicker of understanding. Clara spoke softly, not because she expected to be understood, but because the silence felt too heavy, too vast. "You're safe now," she murmured. "You're warm, just rest." As the hours passed, the woman's shivering subsided, replaced by a deep, shuddering groan of pain that had nothing to do with the cold. Her back arched, and her hands clenched the blanket. Clara's blood ran cold. She knew little of childbirth, only what she had gleaned from the hushed, practical conversations of married women back in Ohio. But she recognized the primal, rhythmic agony of labor. The blizzard had not just driven this woman to her door, it had driven her into giving birth. A profound and terrifying sense of inadequacy washed over Clara. She was alone, miles from any help, with a woman who did not speak her language, about to bring a child into a world of ice and wind. For a moment, she felt the old resignation return, the urge to surrender to the overwhelming impossibility of it all. Then, the woman cried out again, a sound of pure, unendurable pain, and looked at Clara, her eyes pleading. In that look, Clara saw not a stranger, not an Indian, but another woman, terrified and vulnerable, and she knew she could not fail her. The night was a long, harrowing crucible. Time dissolved into a blur of boiling water, whispered words of encouragement, and shared guttural breaths. Clara held the woman's hand, wiped her brow, and moved with an instinct she never knew she had. She, who had dreamed of her own children, born in a safe, warm bed surrounded by family, was now a midwife in a desolate cabin, helping to deliver the child of a stranger from another world. It was a raw, bloody, and profoundly sacred business that stripped away everything but their shared humanity. In the grey hours before dawn, with the storm finally spent, a new sound filled the cabin, the thin, wailing cry of a baby boy. Exhausted but alive, the young mother, who Clara would come to know was named Winona, drifted into a feverish, fitful sleep. The baby, small and perfect, was nestled in a makeshift cradle Clara had fashioned from a crate. The connection forged in the crucible of birth was palpable, a silent thread of trust woven in the dark. Clara tended to them both, her own weariness a distant hum beneath the surface of her new responsibility. In the days that followed, a fragile routine was established. Winona was weak, battling a fever that left her listless and frail. Clara nursed her with broth and herbal teas, her knowledge gleaned from her mother's old remedies. She cared for the baby, changing his swaddling, rocking him to sleep, feeling a fierce, protective tenderness that ached in her chest. It was a bittersweet echo of the life she was supposed to have had. During her lucid moments, Winona would watch Clara with the baby, her dark eyes filled with a quiet, profound gratitude. She spoke a few times, her voice a weak rasp. "Chaitan," she would murmur, her gaze distant, filled with longing. Clara understood it was a name. The name of the baby's father, her husband. She saw the love in Winona's face and felt a pang of her own loss, but it was softer now, dulled by the immediacy of the life and death she had just witnessed. One afternoon, as Clara was changing the baby, she noticed him shivering, his tiny body struggling against the chill that still seeped through the cabin walls. The blankets she had were coarse and thin. Her eyes fell on the steamer trunk at the foot of her bed, on the ghost that lived inside it. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The dress was all she had left of that other life, a symbol of her worth, her purity, her stolen future. To touch it was to touch the raw nerve of her humiliation. Yet the baby shivered again, a tiny, helpless tremor. She looked from the infant to Winona, who was watching her, her brow furrowed with concern. With a trembling hand, Clara opened the trunk. The scent of lavender and regret rose to meet her. She lifted the dress. The silk felt impossibly smooth, the lace as delicate as a spider's web. For a moment, she clutched it to her chest, a final, silent farewell to Clara Prescott, the bride. Then, with a firm, decisive movement, she took her sewing shears from her basket. The sound of the blades slicing through the fine silk was shockingly loud in the quiet cabin. It was a sound of desecration and of liberation. She cut a large, soft square from the voluminous skirt and wrapped the baby in it. The ivory silk, meant for a walk down a church aisle, was now a swaddling cloth, warm and gentle against his skin. The baby sighed, his shivering ceased, and he settled into a peaceful sleep. Winona's eyes widened, first in confusion, then in dawning comprehension. She looked at the remnant of the magnificent garment in Clara's hands, at the raw, cut edge, and then at her peacefully sleeping son. She did not understand what a wedding dress was, but she understood sacrifice. She understood that a thing of great beauty and value had been destroyed for the comfort of her child. Clara then looked at Winona, shivering under the thin wool blankets, and made another decision. The dress was already violated, its purpose was already gone, but it could have a new one. Without a word, she unfolded the rest of an impossibly beautiful, foolishly impractical garment. She held it out to Winona. Tears welled in Winona's eyes. Through gestures, she tried to refuse, pointing to its beauty, shaking her head. But Clara was insistent, helping her sit up, gently guiding her arms into the lace sleeves. The dress, designed for a different body and a different world, was loose and ill-fitting, but it was made of layers of silk and cotton, and it was warm. It covered her in a way the worn buckskin never could. Winona touched the soft fabric against her cheek, and a single tear traced a path through the grime on her face. In that shared, silent moment, the final barrier between them dissolved. They were no longer white woman and Indian, rescuer and victim. They were two mothers, bound by a child and a dress made of shattered dreams. The breaking of the blizzard brought the world rushing back in. A week after the baby's birth, the snow had hardened enough for travel, and with it came the town of Prospect's Hope. Clara saw them from the window, a small party of men on horseback, their dark forms stark against the endless white. Her heart sank. It was the sheriff, Mr. Donovan, a man whose piety was as thin as his lips, and with him were two other men from the town council, whose stares had always held more judgment than charity. They had come, they said, to check on her, a concern that felt more like morbid curiosity. Sheriff Donovan dismounted, his boots crunching on the snow, his eyes sweeping over the cabin with a proprietary air. He pushed the door open without knocking. "Miss Prescott," he began, his voice oozing a false concern. "We were worried. A woman alone in this weather." His voice trailed off as his gaze fell upon the scene inside. Winona, sitting up by the fire, clad in the absurdly elegant, tattered wedding dress, holding her silk-swaddled son. The sheriff's face hardened, his feigned kindness evaporating into pure, unvarnished disgust. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "You're harboring a savage." "She was freezing," Clara said, her own voice steady, surprising her with its firmness. She moved to stand partially in front of Winona, a protective gesture that was as unconscious as it was immediate. "Her baby was born here, during the storm." "That is of no consequence," Donovan snapped. The other two men crowded behind him, their faces a mixture of shock and suspicion. "They can't stay here. It ain't safe. It ain't proper. We'll take them to the fort. They'll be looked after there." Clara knew what "looked after" at the fort meant for a sick Lakota woman and a newborn. It was a death sentence delivered with a veneer of civic duty. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it hung in the air with the weight of iron. "She is unwell. The baby is too small. They are staying here until she is strong enough to travel." The sheriff took a step forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "You are in no position to be making demands, Miss Prescott. The town has been charitable to you, given your circumstances. Do not mistake our charity for weakness. Now, stand aside." The air in the small cabin grew thick with tension. It was in that taut, breathless moment that a new sound reached them, the jingle of harnesses and the soft thud of many horses walking on packed snow. Clara glanced out the window and her blood ran cold. A second group of riders was approaching, fanning out in a silent, disciplined half-circle around the cabin. They were not from the town. They were Lakota warriors, their faces grim, their eyes fixed on the sheriff's horses tied outside. At their head rode a man who carried himself with an authority that dwarfed the sheriff's bluster. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face a mask of fierce concentration. His gaze swept over the seamed white men's horses, the cabin, the tracks before locking onto the window where Clara stood. His eyes, dark and piercing, seemed to see everything. This had to be Chayton. The standoff was immediate and absolute. Sheriff Donovan and his men drew their weapons, their bravado curdling into fear. Chayton and his warriors dismounted, their movements economical and deliberate, their bows and rifles held at a ready, but not aggressive, posture. The air crackled with the unspoken threat of violence. Chayton strode toward the cabin, his gaze fixed on the open doorway. When he saw Winona, a flicker of profound relief crossed his face, quickly followed by confusion as he took in the strange white garment she wore. He saw the baby in her arms, wrapped in the same impossibly white material. His eyes then moved to Clara, and finally to the armed, hostile men from the town. "What is this?" Sheriff Donovan shouted, his voice unsteady. "We have this situation under control." Chayton ignored him completely. He spoke to Winona in the low, flowing cadence of their language. Her reply was weak but urgent. As she spoke, she clutched the silk of the dress, then pointed to the baby's swaddling, and finally she looked directly at Clara, her expression one of deep, unwavering gratitude. The sheriff, not understanding but feeling his authority slipping, made a fatal miscalculation. "I am the law here," he bellowed. "I'm taking the squaw and her babe to the fort." He gestured for one of his men to move forward. "Now." Before the man could take a step, Clara moved. She placed herself squarely in the doorway, blocking his path. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her voice was clear and carried in the frigid air. "You will not touch them," she declared. The jilted bride, the quiet object of pity, was gone. In her place stood a woman who had found something to protect. She turned her gaze from the sheriff to Chayton, whose eyes were now fixed on her with a new, intense scrutiny. "She is Winona," Clara said, speaking slowly, hoping he might know a few words of English. "Storm, the baby, born here." She pointed to Winona, then to the baby, then made a rocking motion with her arms. "Sick, cold. No, you cannot take them." Her defiance, her courage, was a language everyone present understood. Winona spoke again to Chayton, her voice stronger this time. She held up the fabric of the dress, her meaning unmistakable. "This woman saved us. This dress, this warmth, it came from her." Chayton looked at Clara, and for the first time he saw her. He saw past the color of her skin, past the strangeness of the situation. He saw the truth in her unwavering gaze, the fierce protectiveness that mirrored his own. He saw the sacrifice stitched into the very fabric his wife and child now wore. He understood that the most valuable thing this woman possessed, the symbol of her own hope, had been given to his family. It was an act of honor that transcended enmity, an act of profound kindness in a world that offered little. An older warrior, who carried himself with the quiet dignity of a leader and who Clara guessed was Chayton's father, murmured something to him. Chayton nodded, his decision made. He turned his gaze upon Sheriff Donovan, and though he spoke no English, his authority was absolute. He pointed a single finger away from the cabin, toward the town. The gesture was calm, deliberate, and utterly non-negotiable. It said, "Leave." The sheriff sputtered, his face red with fury and humiliation. He looked at the dozen grim-faced warriors, then at his two terrified companions. The odds were not in his favor. With a curse, he holstered his weapon. "This isn't over, Miss Prescott," he snarled, his parting shot laced with venom. He and his men mounted their horses and retreated, their departure ignominious and swift, leaving only silence and the vast white landscape in their wake. The days that followed were filled with a strange, quiet peace. Chayton and his men made camp nearby, a protective presence that kept the world at bay. Winona, with the help of the medicines and care of her own people, began to recover her strength quickly. The baby, now named Tokala, meaning fox, grew stronger each day. Clara found herself in an unexpected position, an honored guest between two worlds. Warriors would bring her offerings of smoked meat or a brace of rabbits. The women who had come with the party would smile at her, their initial suspicion replaced by a deep respect. She shared her small cabin, her food, her fire, and in return, they shared their quiet companionship. She learned a few words of their language, and they learned some of hers. The wedding dress was cleaned and cared for by Winona with a reverence that touched Clara deeply. She watched Chayton from a distance. He was a man of few words but profound presence. He was gentle with his wife and son, a fierce protector of his people, and he treated Clara with a formal, deep respect that was more healing than any apology from Walter could ever have been. He saw her not as a jilted woman, but as a person of honor. In his eyes, she was not diminished, she was valued. The day came when Winona was strong enough to travel. The camp was a quiet hum of activity as they prepared to leave. Clara felt a familiar pang of loss, the prospect of the silence and loneliness returning to her small cabin. She was giving Tokala a final cuddle, his body warm in her arms, when Chayton appeared at her open door. One of his warriors, who spoke more English than the others, stood with him. "He wishes to speak with you," the warrior said. Clara nodded, handing the baby back to Winona, who gave her hand a grateful squeeze. She stood before Chayton, her heart strangely calm. "He says," the translator began, "that our people do not forget a debt. What you did for his wife and his son is a thing that cannot be repaid with horses or hides. You saved the life of his heir. You saved the life of his heart." Chayton's eyes met hers, and he spoke himself then, his Lakota words soft but firm. The translator waited for him to finish. "He says you gave them the most honored cloth of your people, the dress of joining. Winona has explained what it means. You gave away your own future to protect theirs. This is an act of spirit, an act of family." Clara, felt a blush rise to her cheeks, unsure what to say. "I only did what anyone would have done." The translator relayed her words, and Chaitan shook his head slowly. "No," the translator continued. "Not anyone. He says the men from your town would have let them die. You chose to see a mother and child. You chose honor." There was a long pause. Chaitan looked around the small, empty cabin, at the starkness of her solitary life. He then looked back at her, his gaze direct and unwavering. He spoke again, a longer speech this time, his tone serious, considered. The translator took a deep breath before speaking. "The son of a chief may have more than one wife. It is our way, for alliances, for family. The first wife is not just a wife. She is a woman of honor, a partner. She shares his place in the council. She is respected by all. Winona is his betrothed, the mother of his firstborn. She will be his wife. Their hearts are bound." He paused. "But he says a bond of spirit is also a powerful thing. A life was saved. A great honor was given. Our way demands that this also be honored. He offers you the place of the first wife. He offers you a home with his people, a family, a position of respect, not because you are a woman to be owned, but because your spirit is strong. He chooses you." Clara was stunned into silence. The offer was so far beyond the realm of anything she could have ever conceived that she could barely process it. She, Clara Prescott, the jilted bride of Prospect's hope, offered a place of honor as the first wife of a Lakota chief's son. It was impossible. It was madness. She looked past Chaitan, out the door of her cabin. She saw the endless, empty snow, the town that had shamed her, the future of lonely, bitter survival that awaited her there. She thought of the whispers, the pity, the cold judgment. Her life here was a prison of another's making. The wedding dress, the symbol of that life, was gone. It had been transformed into a swaddling cloth, into a mantle of warmth, into a bridge between two souls. It had died so that something new could be born. She then looked at Chaitan. She saw not a savage, as the town would call him, but a man of quiet integrity and profound strength. She saw Winona, who was watching them from a distance, a soft, understanding smile on her face. She saw a future that was not about being chosen for her beauty or her dowry, but for her character. It was an offer not of servitude, but of partnership, an offer of belonging. A slow smile touched Clara's lips, the first genuine smile in months. It felt like a sunrise after a long, dark night. Her old life was over, her old dreams had turned to ash. But here, in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness, from the depths of her despair, a new path had opened, one paved with an act of unexpected kindness. She took a single step forward, leaving the threshold of the empty cabin behind. She met Chaitan's gaze and gave a single, firm nod. She did not need a translator to convey her answer. In her eyes, he saw her choice, and he saw her strength. She was no longer a jilted bride running from a past of shame. She was a woman walking toward a future she would build for herself, a first wife, a woman of honor, stepping into the embrace of a new family, a new home, and a new life under the vast open sky.